Chapter 8, Legalism, Opponent of Christian Freedom, page 237. You are not under law but under undeserved kindness. Romans, chapter 6 verse 14. They attempted to tie us up with rules and regulations. Galatians, chapter 2 verse 4, Phillips Modern English. Legalism has been a major obstacle to genuine Christianity from the earliest of times. It was already manifest when Jesus appeared as God's sent one, the Messiah. It particularly dominated the thinking of the group known as the Pharisees. That name means the separated ones, and as one reference work states, there is much to be said for the view that the group received their name through understanding themselves as the fellowship which embodied the true Israel and distancing themselves from the rest of the nation. The footnote reads, Dictionary of New Testament Theology, Volume 2, page 810. End of footnote. Historically, the fellowship of the Pharisees was born in pre-Christian times as part of a movement that had an essentially noble goal, to encourage religious devotion and obedience to God's law, the Torah, a course then being threatened by growing Greek influence. Such Hellenization had, from the time of Alexander the Great's conquest of Israel, been steadily encroaching upon the thinking, practices, and daily life of the Jewish nation. The Pharisees believed that a return to full obedience to the God-given law was vital in order to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. Consequently, they claimed to be ardent supporters and defenders of the purity of the worship of God. Jesus himself acknowledged that they had a degree of righteousness. Matthew, chapter 5 verse 20. In the end, however, they wound up being among the prime opposers of the Messiah at his coming. No other group came in for such strong and repeated censure from Christ. Their concern for demonstrating loyalty to God and his law had turned into legalism, a legalism that caused them to become narrow and rigid and to lose sight of those things which are the most vital, including justice, mercy, faithfulness and love of neighbor. Matthew, chapter 12 verse 1 to 14, chapter 23 verse 23, they were intensely concerned about avoiding anything that could make them unclean before God. They sought to make a fence around the law, ostensibly as a protection against anyone's overstepping it and transgressing. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower May 1, 1980, page 6. End of footnote. To accomplish this, they set out to comment, analyze, and interpret Torah the law to meet every possible case and contingency of life with an industry and persistence that would have done credit to medieval schoolmen. The result was a subtle and intricate web of case law, which was also a terrible drag on ordinary human existence. The footnote reads, W.H.C. Freud, The Rise of Christianity, Fortress Press, Philadelphia, 1984, pages 24, 25. End of footnote. Jesus described it as the laying of heavy burdens on men's shoulders, burdens that the religious leaders would not budge with one of their fingers. Matthew, chapter 23 verse 4, ultimately their zeal for ruling on all possible applications of the law brought them into conflict with God's word, as the traditions they developed in applying that law resulted in nullifying the more vital principles of that word. Matthew, chapter 15 verse 1 to 9, their extreme focus on law inevitably caused them to become self-righteous, priding themselves on their superior obedience and their various abstentions. As a result, they became judgmental of others who did not measure up to their standards and adhere to the interpretations of law they developed and the program of routine acts of piety they performed. They trusted in themselves that they were righteous and considered the rest as nothing. The footnote reads, Luke, chapter 18 verse 1 to 14, compare John, chapter verse 49. End of footnote. I believe that ancient pattern can be seen in modern times, with virtually identical results. A great body of law developed. The Watchtower's publications have often spoken in very negative terms about the development among the Jews of a Talmud based on rabbinical interpretations of the Mosaic Law. Yet over the past 4 decades the organization has developed its own body of law, one of remarkable extent and complexity. This has all been done in the name of keeping the congregation clean and separate from the world, thereby assuring its righteousness before God. The organization itself acknowledges the existence of such law. Thus, in an article titled "Do You Belittle Discipline?" under the subheading "Disciplined Every Step of the Way," the Watchtower stressed the role of the New World Society, a once popular name for describing the witness organization, in supplying such discipline, and said, "So it is that by the New World Society's application of the stated scriptural commands, examples, rules, and principles to the issues and problems of life, a great body of theocratic law is being built up." The footnote reads: The Watchtower, May 15, 1963, page 300. End of footnote. That great body of theocratic law has become far greater during the 3 decades since that article was written. Clearly, this is not merely a matter of taking direct statements from Scripture, for in that case it would not be described as a building up of a great body of theocratic law. The building up results from the interpreting of such scriptural statements, enlarging upon them, extending them into more and more detailed application to the issues and problems of life, not merely as a form of exposition or exhortation, but with the interpretations themselves now becoming theocratic law. It is not necessary for such rules of conduct or action to be specifically called laws for them to be laws. As we have seen, law is rightly defined as a binding custom or practice of a community, a rule of conduct or action prescribed or formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. Law contrasts with a precept, since law implies imposition by a sovereign authority and the obligation of obedience on the part of all subject to that authority, whereas precept commonly suggests something advisory and not obligatory, communicated typically through teaching. The footnote reads: Webster's 9th New Collegiate Dictionary, under law, with synonyms. End of footnote. While believing they are no longer under Mosaic law, the evidence is that Jehovah's Witnesses have come under another law, submitting to it, having come to believe that their righteousness is firmly tied to keeping it. Replacing one system of legal control with another, that is the way matters are presented in another Watchtower publication titled "Pay Attention to Yourselves and All the Flock," part of a Kingdom Ministry school textbook designed for use in seminars held with elders of Jehovah's Witnesses in 1981. The footnote reads: This textbook was prepared under the direction of the teaching committee of the governing body. Among its members then were Albert Schroeder, Carl Klein, Leo Serenles, Ted Urash. End of footnote. 0 and page 144, we find the following. Under the law of the Christ, Galatians, chapter 6 verse 2, Jehovah's people today are not under the control of the body of law known as the Mosaic law of ancient Israel. Colossians, chapter 2 verse 13, 14, Paul showed that since there has been a change in the priesthood from Aaron to that of Jesus Christ in the manner of Melchizedek, Christians are under a new legal arrangement of control. Hebrews, chapter 5 verse 4.6, chapter 7 verse 12, some rules of conduct found in the old law of Moses have been restated under the law of the Christ and are enforceable upon Christians. Acts, chapter 15 verse 19 to 21, other rules of conduct from the law of Moses with their underlying principles, though not enforceable in the Christian congregation, are nevertheless useful to Christians as they walk in the way of holiness. James, chapter 2 verse 8, 9, it is well for elders to consider some of these guidelines that are intended to protect the Christian congregation and keep it clean in Jehovah's sight. Ephesians, chapter 5 verse 25 to 27. Law of the Christian congregation. Christians are not under the Mosaic law, but under the law of the Christ. Galatians, chapter 6 verse 2, 1 Corinthians, chapter 9 verse 21, consists of a body of rules for Christian conduct. Galatians, chapter 6 verse 16. The doctrine is advanced that Christians are under a new legal arrangement of control, a body of rules for Christian conduct that is enforceable on Christians. This is no more than a roundabout way of saying a new law code. A simple reading of the text cited in the paragraphs following the heading will make plain that the words found in those verses are made to say something other than what they actually say, often by ignoring the context. The scriptures themselves make clear what the law of the Christ, referred to at Galatians, chapter 6 verse 2, is, and it is definitely not a new legal arrangement of control or a body of rules. The footnote reads, the context, in fact, speaks of it as being fulfilled in bearing one another's burdens. End of footnote. When God brought Christians out from under the law covenant into his new covenant, which change he accomplished through Christ as both mediator and high priest, he did not cause them to pass from one law code to another law code, or legal arrangement of a body of rules. His word states that thenceforth his law would be written on hearts, not on stone or parchment or vellum or any other writing materia. 1. The footnote reads, Jeremiah, chapter 31 verse 31 to 33, Hebrews, chapter 8 verse 8 to 10. End of footnote. The law of the Christ is found in his teachings, his example and way of life, none of which point to any new legal arrangement of control. His law is instead shown to be the royal law of love and the law of faith, and neither love nor faith can possibly be reduced to, or fully expressed by, a body of rules and regulations. Compare Galatians, chapter 6 verse 2 with Romans, chapter 3 verse 27, 28, chapter 13 verse 8, James, chapter 2 verse 8. You cannot legislate love and faith into people's hearts. That is doubtless why the Apostle Paul says that the law is not based on faith, because law, in the sense of a body of rules, is essentially predicated, not on faith, but simply upon compliance, either you do it or you do not. Law-keeping becomes the criterion of righteousness. Those keeping the rules are counted righteous, those who do not are punished. The footnote reads, Galatians, chapter 3 verse 10 to 12, New International Version. End of footnote. The superior importance of faith is to that extent obscured. For such serious reasons the Apostle presented the issue of Christian freedom, including freedom from being under some humanly enforceable religious law system, in the strongest terms, saying, I do not shove aside the undeserved kindness of God, for if righteousness is through law, Christ actually died for nothing. The footnote reads, Galatians, chapter 2 verse 21. End of footnote. You are parted from Christ, whoever you are that try to be declared righteous by means of law, you have fallen away from his undeserved kindness. The footnote reads, Galatians, chapter 5 verse 4. End of footnote. To teach that Christians in the New Covenant are again under a new legal arrangement of control denies the scriptural teaching that God's law is now written on human hearts, the control being accomplished, not by a body of laws, but by Holy Spirit. It negates the Christian freedom that results from being, not under law, but under undeserved kindness or grace. This teaching would condemn Christians to death, for by works of law no flesh will be declared righteous, since law inevitably condemns those under it due to their inability to observe it perfectly. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 3 verse 20, Galatians, chapter 3 verse 10, 11. End of footnote. It leads to the same self-deception that many under the law covenant fell prey to, that of seeking to establish one's own righteousness by law observance, carrying out the duties imposed by law. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 10 verse 3, 4. End of footnote. It allows for the same boasting and feeling of superiority over others that were typical of those in Jesus' day who stressed a strict holding to rule as defined by their religious leaders, those who took pride in their compliance with regulations. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 12 verse 1 to 10, Luke, chapter 18 verse 9 to 12, John, chapter 7 verse 49. End of footnote. Worst of all, it minimizes and detracts from the magnificence of God's love, in that he gives life, not as a reward for observing laws, Mosaic or any other, but as a free gift, accepted by faith, appreciated through love and responded to by loving acts, but never earned. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 3 verse 21 to 25, 5 verse 15 to 17. End of footnote. In 1976, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses decided to make a revision of its manual called Aid to Answering Branch Office Correspondence. The manual serves to direct all branch committees of the organization in their handling of problems. The purpose of the revision was so that the manual would contain the more recent decisions of the governing body. Staff members Gene Smalley and Robert Wallen were assigned to draft an updated manual, and they submitted their proposed revision in September 1977, the work having been done primarily by Smalley. The writing committee assigned me to do the final editing of the material. I found the assignment a depressing one. Though familiar with the original manual from past experience, I now felt the full force of the extent to which a legalistic outlook had come to dominate the organization's approach to Christianity. 2 years later I still had not completed the editing and in fact had made very little progress. I offered to turn over the assignment to someone else, but Lyman Swingle, then the coordinator of the writing committee, said he personally was in no hurry to see the material finished, that as far as he was concerned the longer it was left on the back burner the better. Consider the index of the 114 pages of the proposed material. Virtually every area of life, family and marital affairs, employment, social and community relationship is covered by one or another of the policies contained in this publication. But the 174 headings listed in the index gives only a surface view of the reality found in the pages, a small idea of just how extensive and complex the organizational policies had become. And even the manual's pages tell only a portion of the story, for they contain abundant references to Watchtower articles which spell out in even greater detail the technicalities of the policies developed. The proliferation of rulings and sub-rulings found in its pages, some directly enforceable and others only subtly so, can only be described as Talmudic. And every year that passes sees new rulings formulated as a result of governing body sessions. Though the revised manual was to be called Correspondence Guidelines, any person who occupies the position of congregational elder, traveling overseer, or branch committee member knows that the manual's contents form no mere guide but have the force of law. He knows that if he does not adhere closely to these policies and decisions in his handling of matters, he will be subjected to discipline. These policies are, in fact, treated with the same respect as if they were direct statements from Scripture, divine law. Witnesses are taught to view them in this way. As far back as the Watchtower of May 15, 1944, page 152, we find this statement: "It must always be kept in mind that God's organization of his people is theocratic, not democratic. The laws of his organization come from himself, the great theocrat, Jehovah, the Supreme One." Quaintly put, a theocratic organization is ruled from the top down, which means from the Most High God downward, and not from the bottom up, that is, from the people of the congregation upward. It is quite evident that what is called the great body of theocratic law found today within the witness organization did not originate with the people of the congregation, those at the so-called bottom. The top from which this body of law emanated, however, was in reality no higher than the leadership of the witness community, its actual controlling authority. Legalism's subtle invasion the organization's own history shows that, basically, the so-called great body of theocratic law began its growth during the presidency of the second president of the Watchtower Society, Joseph F. Rutherford, from 1916 to 1942, for during the presidency of the founder of the society, Charles Taze Russell, from 1881 to 1916, the organization was notably free of legalism. Following Russell's death and Rutherford's election to the presidency, a totally different tone and spirit manifested itself in the organization's administration. Rutherford was not a person inclined to tolerate disagreement. We have already seen that A. H. Macmillan, a close associate of Rutherford, said that he would never tolerate anything that would be contrary to what he clearly understood the Bible to teach. The footnote reads, underlining mine. End of footnote. This statement reveals not only the propensity for control the society's president had and the enormous authority with which he had vested himself, but also that it was his understanding of what the scriptures taught which determined what all members must be guided by. Those of us among the witnesses who lived during that presidency know that being theocratic came to mean that we would accept virtually without question whatever instructions were received from the headquarters organization. We have seen the manner in which field service became essentially a work of law for all members. This initial step was followed by others as additions to the great body of theocratic law. During Rutherford's presidency it came to include such matters as the refusal to salute a flag or stand for a national anthem, refusal to accept alternative service provided for those who had conscientious objections to military service, all issues not specifically dealt with in Scripture. If individuals on the basis of personal conviction could not conscientiously engage in any, or all, of these things, then they rightly should abstain. Compare Romans, chapter 14 verse 5 to 12, 22, 23. But none of these matters were left to individual conscience, they now became organizational law, and adherence to that law in all respects was required for one to be counted a faithful Christian. Nonetheless, during Rutherford's lifetime the volume of laws developed was tiny compared to what was to follow. While those failing to follow them were looked down upon as compromisers, no punitive measures, such as disfellowshipping, were taken toward them on a congregational level. In other areas, only conduct that showed severe violations of morality brought disfellowshipment, and during my early years of association these expulsions seemed quite rare. There was certainly not the inclination to scrutinize people's lives that later became so common. The major period of theocratic legislation, it was in the 1950s that the real development of what amounts to a complete system of law for Jehovah's Witnesses began, a code of rules and regulations that covers virtually every aspect of life. This came largely as the result of a growing emphasis on the process of disfellowshipping which surfaced during the preceding decade, particularly from 1944 onward. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, May 15, 1944, pages 151 to 155. These articles discuss such texts as Matthew, chapter 18 verse 15 to 17, 1 Corinthians, chapter 6 verse 1 to 8, and 2 Thessalonians, chapter 3 verse 14. They mainly emphasized that the handling of matters of wrong conduct was not to be done by the congregation as a body, as was the case previously, but by authorized theocratic representatives. See also page 246 and the statement there quoted from this 1944 magazine. Later articles built upon this basis and led to ever greater involvement by appointed congregational servants in judicial matters. End of footnote. For the first few ensuing years there was simply discussion of the scriptural counsel itself, as for example the Apostolic Council at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, with its exhortation not to fellowship with anyone who calls himself a brother but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. The footnote reads, 1 Corinthians, chapter 5 verse 11, New International Version. End of footnote. There is no question as to the validity of that counsel and the wisdom of adhering to it. But the organization now began to branch out from such scriptural exhortation into the field of legislation, so that in course of time an actual code of rules came into existence. In what way did all this come about? How did a few early rules formulated and enforced during Rutherford's presidency later experience a virtual explosion into the present great body of law? The headquarters administration at Brooklyn maintains what is called a service department. This department supervises the activity in the United States of all traveling representatives, circuit and district overseers, and that of all congregational representatives, elders and ministerial servants. Questions on policy and procedure received from any of these sources are regularly handled by the Service Department, whose staff members have divided among them various sections of the country. With the increased emphasis on disfellowshipping, particularly from the 1950s on, questions began to arrive from congregational overseers and traveling overseers requesting more explicit definitions of certain conduct deemed sinful, particularly in the field of sexual immorality, but also embracing other fields. The congregational overseers wanted to know, what was the society's policy in such cases? What action should the congregation take? Inquiries from these men therefore came into the Brooklyn headquarters of the Watchtower. In many cases the section man of the service department did not feel qualified to supply the definition requested or to lay out in specific terms precisely what did or did not constitute grounds for disfellowshipping in the circumstance involved. The standard procedure in all such cases is summed up in an expression that was used again and again with growing frequency. That expression was, "Send it to Freddie." By Freddie was meant Fred Franz, who was then the Watchtower Society's vice president and the acknowledged principal writer and Bible scholar for the organization. The question was forwarded to him and he supplied the requested definition or application of Scripture to the matter, usually in the form of a memorandum. Since in most cases, the Scriptures themselves contained no specific discussion of the matter in question, much of the answer's content consisted of interpretative reasoning, the reasoning of the vice president. His responses were, of course, subject to approval by the president, Nathan nor, even to his veto, though that seems to have been infrequent. There is also no doubt that the manner in which the service department presented the issues, and their observations made when submitting the questions, influenced the replies they received and thus played a measurable part in the policies that actually developed. The vice president had no first-hand knowledge whatsoever of the circumstances involved in the cases. Furthermore, he had no personal communication with the persons whose lives would be affected by the decisions he rendered. I do not question the sincerity of Fred Franz's efforts in this area. But the result, I believe, illustrates how wrong it is to allocate to any man, not the mere extending of counsel or advice, but the actual deciding of matters that rightfully should rest with the individual consciences of those personally involved. However sincere the vice president was, it is an undeniable fact that his rather cloistered life at the headquarters from his early 20s onward had largely isolated him from life as lived by ordinary people on the outside, a term used frequently by staff workers at the Watchtower headquarters with reference to life outside their select community. The things being experienced by those who were engaged in secular employment, who had homes and families, knew what it was to be married or to be parents, had to face the problems and difficulties of day-to-day living as most people face them, formed little or no part of his own experience. From my own personal association with him over many years, it was evident that he was quite detached, or perhaps the expression could be insulated from the reality of life as lived by the average person. He was in no sense a hermit and accepted occasional invitations to people's homes for meals or weekends, but he was always the special guest, someone looked upon as different from ordinary people. Conversation rarely if ever dealt with the more mundane aspects of human occupations. I recall one summer in the late 1940s or early 1950s when he was at our family home in Kentucky on vacation, as I was also there on vacation from Puerto Rico, and he commented on himself and Nathan Knorr, saying, "Brother Knorr is a practical man. I am a scholar." I am sure he was not an unfeeling person, yet in his outlook toward the problems of human living he seemed somewhat otherworldly, at times almost fatalistic about difficulties and even tragedies. For me, one instance of this was notably impressive. In the 1970s a nephew of mine contracted a sudden pancreas infection that in just 3 days ended his life. He was only 34. He left behind a lovely young wife and 2 small daughters. At the funeral, which my wife and I attended, the funeral parlor was packed. As the invited speaker, the society's vice president, great uncle to the deceased, walked up to the podium, paused, and then in a very loud, almost stentorian, voice said, "Isn't it grand to be alive?" The footnote reads, "I still vividly recall the sinking sensation I felt in my heart at this." End of footnote. After that introductory exclamation, for several minutes he discussed, effectively and dramatically, the meaning of the words at Ecclesiastes, chapter 7 verse 1-4. The footnote reads, "These verses read, the New World Translation, a name is better than good oil, and the day of death than the day of one's being born. Better is it to go to the house of mourning than to go to the banquet house, because that is the end of all mankind, and the one alive should take it to his heart. Better is vexation than laughter, for by the crossness of the face the heart becomes better. The heart of the wise ones is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the stupid ones is in the house of rejoicing." End of footnote. As yet my nephew had not been mentioned in any way. Then, after approximately 10 minutes, in referring to the words about it being better for us to go to the house of mourning, the speaker said, and the reason why is that sooner or later we're all going to end up like this, and, without turning, he threw his hand backward in the direction of the coffin where my nephew's body lay. The talk went on with further commentary on the biblical section but with no other reference to the dead man until the close, when the standard statements of the reason for the occasion and the names of the deceased survivors were given. I felt a sense of burning anger, not at my uncle, for I sincerely and honestly believe he thought this was the best way to deal with the situation, the best way to combat the natural sensations of grief and loss. What I felt incensed at was the organizational attitude that allowed a person to feel fully justified to speak in a way which essentially transformed the dead person's body into a vehicle or platform on which to base a talk that expounded organizational doctrine, but which throughout simply made no mention of sadness at the loss of the person whose life had ended, as though by ignoring this the hurt would be lessened. I kept saying to myself, James deserves something better than this. Surely the text about a name being better than good oil calls for talking about the name he made for himself in life. Surely there is something that can be learned from his life, something about him that can be said to encourage us, the living. The footnote reads, I had been asked to give a prayer following the talk, and I remember feeling somewhat choked, and that I began by saying, an enemy has come into our midst and has robbed us of a loved one. A wife has lost her husband. Little children have lost a father. A father and a mother have lost a son. And we all have lost a friend. Then, for the first time, I could hear some expressions of sorrow among those attending, and I frankly found it a welcome sound. I tried to include some of the good things about the man, things worth our imitating, for I thought, surely now if ever is the time to express appreciation for whatever worthwhile qualities he had. We owe it to him, to his memory. End of footnote. Once again, I do not think my uncle lacked any of the feelings I had, or lacked a capacity for sorrow and compassion. I believe he simply reflected his training and a lifetime of disciplining himself against expressing strong feeling about anything other than theocratic interests. The footnote reads, in the 1980s, when conducting the morning text for the Bethel family, he emphasized the importance of the work the headquarters staff was doing by relating that, in 1939, when notified by his mother of his father's death, he informed her that he would not be able to make it to the funeral due to the severe press of work at Bethel. His mother angrily phoned Judge Rutherford and, as my uncle told it, the judge ordered him to go to the funeral. This was said with no evident sense of embarrassment, but rather as illustrative of the importance he gave to his assigned work at Bethel, the house of God. Compare Matthew, chapter 15 verse 3-5. End of footnote. Despite his degree of seminarian otherworldliness and his own recognition of his lack of practicality, he was handed the responsibility of making decisions in a very broad range of areas where he had no personal experience whatsoever, and where the scriptures themselves were essentially silent. To his credit, in one of the early governing body sessions I shared in, he expressed appreciation that such decisions were no longer left to him to make as an individual, and that the responsibility was now shared with others. The footnote reads, nonetheless, when the rightness of earlier positions and policies came into question, he generally argued against change and expressed this sentiment in his vote. End of footnote. Unfortunately, the majority of his fellow governing body members were not much more in touch than he was with the problems of life most people experience, particularly if they had spent most their life at the Brooklyn headquarters, as many had. The footnote reads, contrary to what some might think, Nathan nor inclined to be more reasonable in these areas. He and Franz thus at times were on opposite sides of the fence in some of the voting. Out of all the governing body members only one, Albert Schroeder, knew what it was to be a parent, and even in his case he did not know what it was to do so as the average working man does, since even after the birth of his son he continued to be employed by the society in teaching assignments as a Kingdom Ministry school instructor, with his housing and other needs cared for. End of footnote. True, Most of these men engaged in at least some door-to-door work among the public and had their social contacts with witness friends living on the outside, but, on the whole, these were somewhat like excursions, quickly over and then they returned inside, to their own self-contained city of Bethel, where all their needs were supplied. At Bethel their rooms were cleaned, beds made, clothes washed and pressed, meals cooked and served, shoes repaired, or suits cleaned and pressed for a nominal fee, and they never had to think of rent, property upkeep and repair, health insurance, or anything more than a minimal amount of taxes. They shared in the good things others on the outside offered them, but rarely if ever shared in their difficulties and hardships. In the course of time, the service department, then under the direction of Harley Miller as office overseer, began collating Franz's replies and placing them in binders. They were regularly referred to when handling questions coming in from the field. The department had several volumes of such memoranda accumulated when some years later the president, Nathan Knorr, made one of his periodic inspection visits to the department. Seeing the volumes, Knorr inquired as to what they were. After being informed, he instructed the department to eliminate them and they were subsequently destroyed. They no longer have those volumes in the service department. They have new ones composed now of the decisions that the governing body makes and they use them in much the same way as they used the old ones. Of course, many of the replies supplied by then Vice President Franz, had been eventually put in print in the columns of the Watchtower magazine. And there is no question that the basic framework on which the whole system of the great body of theocratic law rests was developed during that earlier period. The governing body generally has done little more than build extensions onto that basic framework, or define more specifically certain details found therein. It would be impossible to discuss even a small fraction of the total, but consider here just a few examples. Theocratic law in actual application. The revised manual, to be called Correspondence Guidelines, as it was turned over to me for editing, contained 13 pages on employment, a field of legislation into which the organization had not ventured previous to the 1950s. It began with the statement, found elsewhere in the Watchtower publications, that, while an individual's employment can affect his standing in the congregation, it is not for us to tell anyone what kind of work he may or may not do. This sounds nice, but in reality it simply means that while the organization cannot control or dictate a person's choice of employment, an obvious fact, it nevertheless may censure him for that choice or even disfellowship him for choosing or continuing in an employment that the organization has ruled unacceptable. That is the way it works out in actual practice. The manual as submitted contains several pages of examples to illustrate the policies set out. Under the subheading, work that is not itself unscriptural but that links one with a wrong practice or makes one a promoter of it, the manual supplied such examples as these. Example: 2 women work as maids on a military base. One is employed in a home by a family, the husband of which is in the military. The other is a maid employed to clean the barracks. Comments: the first woman concludes that she could accept such work for the family and not be in conflict with Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4, which speaks of beating one's swords into plowshares and not learning war anymore. She reasons that, despite the location of her work and the fact that the breadwinner of the family is in the military, she is providing a common service for individuals in a home and is not employed by an organization in conflict with the scriptures. 2 Kings, chapter 5 verse 2, 3, chapter 5 verse 15 to 19, Philippians, chapter 4 verse 22, she continues to be a member of the congregation, though if she sought the privilege of pioneer service, consideration might have to be given to how her employment is affecting others and whether she is viewed as a good example. The other woman, by her regular work, is performing a needed service in the accomplishment of the overall objectives of an organization, the purpose of which is out of harmony with Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. She is paid by the military, works on military property and is doing work regularly that makes her a part of that organization and its objectives. She is in conflict with Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. Thus, the first woman who works domestically for a military man in his household on the base can retain her standing in the congregation. The second, who cleans barracks, perhaps on the same base, cannot. As the rest of the manual and as all Watchtower publications make clear, anyone in conflict with Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4 is either to be disfellowshipped or pronounced disassociated. The footnote reads, the use of the term disassociated came into being as a euphemism, being used in place of disfellowshipped where sensitive issues, such as entering the military, voting, or other such matters were involved. It later came to be used also of anyone who formally withdrew from the organization. Whichever term is used, the effect is the same, for disassociated persons today are treated the same as disfellowshipped persons. End of footnote. The first woman might be paid by an officer, even a general, who orders the men in the barracks into combat. Her pay comes from him, true, but the money comes from his military salary. Still, her work does not make her unclean. The second woman who cleans barracks, because her pay comes from the military as an organization and because she is somehow viewed as contributing to the overall objectives of the military, is counted as blood guilty and worthy of being cut off from the congregation. It is difficult to conceive of more tortured reasoning and emphasis on technical distinctions than this. It is equally difficult not to see a parallel between such legalistic interpretations and those of Pharisaical and ancient rabbinical sources. Compare Matthew, chapter 23 verse 16 to 22. Following this policy, a witness barber might set up a barbershop adjacent to a military base in an area where there were no nearby residences. All his customers might be soldiers, whose pay comes from the military. He would not be judged guilty of violating Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. But if he did the same barbering on the base for those same soldiers, receiving pay from the military administration, he would, by this line of reasoning, be blood guilty, worthy of disfellowshipment. Such reasoning can only be termed Pharisaical. Nor is this a case of mere hypothetical examples. Many actual cases have been dealt with in precisely this manner, including situations involving witness women who worked in PX stores on military bases and whose selling of such items as foodstuffs, cosmetics, etc., in that location somehow made them guilty of supporting the overall objectives of the military and hence blood guilty. Elders have actually taken disfellowshipping action against a man simply for working in pest and rodent control exterminating roaches and mice because this work was regularly performed on a military base. Those viewed as infringing the society's policy are given a period of time, perhaps 6 months, to cease such employment, and if they do not do so they either are disfellowshipped or are declared disassociated, the results being in reality the same. The footnote reads, in actuality the prophecy at Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4 is simply that, a prophecy. It is not set forth as the basis for some kind of law or for a code of rules but simply foretells the peace-giving effects of God's acting among the nations on behalf of his covenant people, Israel. A California University faculty member, commenting on the expression in violation of Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4, said, "How in the world do the witnesses imagine that just because the Bible foretells a peaceful world, no one now must take a job washing the floors in an army base? Might as well say that just because Isaiah, chapter 11 prophesies that the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice den, parents now should let their children into a snake pit." One might also ask why the prophecy at Joel, chapter 3 verse 10 should not be applied with comparable force when it contrastingly says, "Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears." End of footnote. Consider another example from the manual, as proposed, in this same section. Example, a brother owning a plumbing business receives a call to do emergency repairs on a broken water pipe in the basement of a local church. Sometime later a representative of the church contacts another brother, a builder, about putting a new roof and addition on the church. Comments, the first brother concludes that, as a human service, his conscience would permit him to care for the emergency situation, though advising the church to seek another plumber for any regular work. Likely few would be critical of his helping anyone during an emergency or view him as reprehensible. The second brother realizes that, even though he has put roofs and additions on many homes and businesses, For him to contract to do so in the case of the church would be lending considerable support to the advancement of false worship. It would not be just an incidental contact, such as a postman's delivering mail, or an act of humanitarian aid in a desperate situation. It would be a major undertaking that would involve lengthy work on a building used exclusively for the advancement of false worship, aiding in the perpetuation of Babylon the Great. 2 Corinthians, chapter 6 verse 14 to 18, as a Christian he could not do that. By saying as a Christian he could not do that, the manual simply means that if he does he will be subject to disfellowshipping. This, too, is not hypothetical in the least. In the chapter that follows, the extremes to which this policy can be carried are illustrated. Such policies illustrate clearly that the organization is indeed run from the top down and not from the bottom up. What this actually results in is a usurping of the individual's exercise of personal conscience, accomplished by superimposing on his conscience the rulings legislated by the organizational leadership, rulings made binding and enforceable through disfellowshipping decrees. The footnote reads, as shown earlier, this sometimes, particularly where military issues are involved, comes in the form of automatic disassociation. End of footnote. The examples given only touch the surface. Since then, many additional rules have been made. There seems to be nothing on which the organization is not willing to legislate. A question from readers in the June 15, 1982, Watchtower, page 31, even rules on whether a witness can submit to medical treatment in which, to reduce the risk of stroke by blood clot or for other purposes, a leech is used to draw off blood. The answer, based on a very wandering type of argument, is no. The footnote reads, though saying initially that such use of leeches would conflict with what the Bible says, the only scriptures referred to thereafter are God's words to Noah that humans should not eat blood, Genesis, chapter 9 verse 3-4, and his command through Moses that the blood of slain animals be poured onto the ground. Leviticus, chapter 17 verse 10-14, since no human will eat the leech, and no one will likely retain the blood the leech sucks, it is difficult to see what possible connection there is here. End of footnote. Unbalanced thinking. By legalistic thinking, a comparatively innocent minor action can be transformed into a major one of great culpability. In life there is need for balance, since the rightness or wrongness of many things really comes down to a matter of degree. As a simple example, a gentle pat with one's hand on another's cheek signifies affection, whereas a strong slap on the cheek tells of anger, even hatred. The action of the hand and fingers is the same in both cases, it is the difference in the degree of force that converts an expression of affection into one of hatred. So, too, in more complex aspects. While the element of degree may not enter notably into such clear-cut offenses as murder, a murderer does not slightly kill or moderately kill or strongly kill someone, or theft, or adultery, it does play a deciding role in a wide variety of life's affairs. Thus, people commonly work to earn money. This does not, however, justify classing them as greedy. But if the degree of concern for money passes a certain point, then greed is evident. Who can specifically identify that certain point so as to draw a clear line of demarcation, one that divides precisely between the proper and improper concern for gain? It is only when the evidence clearly points to excess that one can feel justified in assessing another as greedy. This is true in a whole host of matters. Again, in Bible times the religious leaders failed to exercise such balance, to distinguish between actions of a minor nature and those which might be termed major. Thus, when they saw Jesus' disciples, on the Sabbath day, picking grains of wheat, rubbing them in their hands to remove the chaff and eating them, they accused them of violating the Sabbath law against work. How could they? Because, in their unbalanced, extremely scrupulous thinking, the men were, in effect, both harvesting and threshing. Indeed, if they had picked large quantities of grain, loading up their cloaks with the wheat, and then rubbed the chaff off, producing piles of such grain, they would have been doing just that. But they were not. And Jesus reproved the religious leaders for condemning the innocent. Matthew, chapter 12 verse 1-7. This same unbalanced thinking seems to be the only explanation for the positions taken by the Watchtower organization in a number of the policies already described. Perhaps nothing demonstrates this more forcefully than does the issue of alternative service to be performed in place of military service. Submission to the superior authorities remind them to be submissive to the government and the authorities, to obey them, and to be ready for any honorable form of work. Titus, chapter 3 verse 1, New English Bible. In many enlightened countries, the government provides for a non-military form of service to be performed instead of military service and training. They do this specifically to show consideration for the conscientious objections of some citizens to participation in war or military service, a concession that is surely commendable. In Crisis of Conscience the subject was discussed in part. The footnote reads, pages 123 to 140. End of footnote. As explained there, the organization's policy was that no witness can accept an order from a draft board, or any other governmental agency other than a court, to perform alternative service, which generally consisted of hospital work, rendering services to elderly people, work in libraries, in a forest camp, or in some other field that would benefit the community at large. Since any of these is clearly an honorable form of work, why was a witness not to accept it? Because in its being alternative service it is a substitute for military service, and because such work stands in the place of military service, then, by some process of reasoning, to accept an alternative service assignment from a draft board was deemed the equivalent of having accepted military service, and therefore one had compromised, had violated his neutrality, and he had thereby become blood guilty. If that reasoning seems remarkably convoluted, there is yet more that follows. At the same time, when the witness refusing was arrested and brought to trial for his refusal to comply with the draft board's orders, and is found guilty, if the judge in the trial then sentenced the individual to perform such alternative service, he could now obey the court order, do the work assigned, and be free from compromise and blood guilt. The reasoning behind this? The person, having been convicted, was now a prisoner and hence had not voluntarily given up his freedom of action and choice of occupation. In actuality, there was nothing voluntary to begin with about the government-assigned service, no more than the payment of money as taxes is voluntary. It was an obligatory, compulsory service, and that is why the man refusing was arrested in the first place. And it might also be said that he had really given up his freedom and choice when he submitted to the Watchtower organizations deciding for him that obedience to an order from the draft board to perform hospital work or other such service is wrong. In doing that, he allowed his conscience to become a prisoner and removed the possibility of making a choice based on personal conscience. But yet another technicality was introduced. The organization even took the position that if, previous to the actual sentence being passed, the witness was asked by the judge if his conscience would allow him to accept an assignment from the court to do hospital work or similar service, he could not answer in the affirmative but must say, "That is for the court to decide." If he answered, "Yes," which would have been a truthful answer, he was considered to have compromised, having made a deal with the judge, and thus had broken his integrity. But if he gave the prescribed, approved response already quoted, and then the judge in sentencing him assigned him to do hospital work or similar service, he could comply. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 148, 149, and footnote 10. End of footnote. He was now not guilty of violating the apostolic exhortation to stop becoming the slaves of men. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 23, surely such technicalities are truly casuistic and the application of the term pharisaical does not seem too harsh. The footnote reads, all of these technical distinctions were worked out from the 1940s on through the 1960s. While final approval unquestionably rested with Nathan Knorr, and while the Society's attorney Hayden Covington was involved during the 1940s and 1950s, the style of reasoning is not typical of either man but is typical of Fred Franz, then vice president. I believe that the later technical distinctions were designed to moderate somewhat the organization's position, thereby reducing the number of those going to prison, in cases where judges were willing to sentence them to hospital or other work, and yet allow for appearing to be upholding the original position in its basic premise as having been right, God-directed. This elaborate policy remained in effect until the May 1, 1996 Watchtower declared it a matter of conscience. End of footnote. This is no light matter. During World War II, in the United States alone some 4,300 young Jehovah's Witnesses went to prison, with sentences ranging as high as 5 years, not simply because of conscientious objection to war, but primarily because, in adhering to the Society's policy, they refused governmental provisions allowing them to perform other service of a non-military nature provided for conscientious objectors. In England, there were 1,593 convictions, including those of 334 women. The footnote reads, "See Jehovah's Witnesses in the Divine Purpose," page 157. End of footnote. Though the policy was rescinded in 1996, there still remained hundreds in prisons in various lands, the imprisonment resulting from their obeying the Society's policy. In 1988, in just the countries of France and Italy there were some 1,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in prison for this reason. The footnote reads, Amnesty International Report for 1988, pages 199, 206. End of footnote. In Crisis of Conscience, when relating the discussion of this issue by the governing body in numerous sessions over a period of years, only brief mention was made of a resulting survey taken among all the branch committees operating throughout the world under the direction of the governing body. The survey was suggested by Milton Henschel since, as he put it, perhaps it would reveal that only a relatively few countries had alternative service provisions. If such were the case, then that would militate against the need for making any policy change. Apparently the fact that men in those few countries were in prison and that other hundreds of men would yet go to prison, if the policy continued as it was, would not be of sufficient weight or gravity to make the issue a crucial one. In the survey the branch committees were to be asked whether the witnesses in their country understood the reasoning behind the policy and its scripturalness and also what the committee members' own views were of the existing policy. Since the governing body assigned me to carry out the survey correspondence with the 90 or more branch committees, I have in my files copies of all their replies. The responses received were revealing. Before considering them, I might here quote a portion of a memorandum submitted to the governing body by member Lloyd Berry. Warning against any change in the existing policy, he wrote, "Those who have studied out the matter on the basis of the Bible and who have been through the experience, have no question about maintaining a stand of no compromise, unless someone comes along and tries to plant such a question. A change of viewpoint sponsored by the governing body would be very upsetting for these countries and brothers, where they have fought for so long in behalf of their uncompromising stand. What do the facts show as to the actual thinking of those affected? Does the picture portrayed in the memorandum fit the reality? The information that follows is fairly extensive, though only a fraction of the whole. I believe it merits the space. The reason is that it so graphically demonstrates the power of indoctrination to cause people to sacrifice liberty, years of life and livelihood and family association, in order to obey something that they do not understand or really believe, doing this purely out of a sense of loyalty to an organization. Anything that produces such a blindly submissive state of mind is fraught with potential danger of even greater consequence. Since disagreement with any position of the organization is generally viewed as indicating a lack of loyalty and even a lack of faith and confidence in God's direction, it is not at all surprising that the majority of the committees expressed full support for the organization's policy. What is surprising is the significant number of branch committees that spoke of serious difficulties of witnesses in their country, either as to understanding the policy or seeing any scriptural basis for it. Not that they were not complying with the policy. Witness men were going to jail rather than act contrary to it. But did they feel, as governing body member Berry put it, that there was no question about the policy that led to their being put in prison? Here are direct quotations from the letters sent by some branch committees: Austria, many of the brothers do not fully understand the scriptural position why we should not render such alternative service. Brazil, we believe that the brothers would have no difficulty to prove their stand if the work involved direct support to the military machine, say, working in a munitions factory or constructing barracks or digging trenches, etc. They would use the same scriptures that they use for objecting to direct military service. The brothers would have difficulty if the work involved building a road for civilian use, or work on some agricultural project or other work of that kind. Italy, from direct contacts made with the brothers faced with a military service problem, we found that in the majority of cases they did not understand why they could not accept alternative civilian service. They maintained that no longer being under the direct jurisdiction of the military authorities because of having been assigned to another ministry, they could accept alternative civilian service just as long as they did not engage in any activity having to do with militarism, but doing non-military work such as in museums or hospitals, etc. They would not be guilty of any violation of their neutrality. Spain, as a part of the research for this report, a member of the branch committee spoke extensively with 3 brothers who were exemplary in their neutral stand years ago. He also conversed with 3 mature elders, 2 of them from other countries, who have not personally faced the issue in Spain. Varying viewpoints surfaced on many aspects of this matter, but there was complete agreement on one point: practically none of our young brothers really understand why we cannot accept substitute service if it is of a civic nature and not under the control of the military. It seems clear that most of the elders do not understand it either, and therefore they often send youngsters to the branch office to get information. So the question comes up, why don't they understand? Is it lack of personal study? Or is it because the arguments and reasonings we have used are not convincing enough or do not have a clear and firm Bible stand? The footnote reads, "In these, and in the quotations that follow, I have underlined certain key points." End of footnote. In addition to the sampling presented, branch committees in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Fiji, France, Germany, Greece, Hawaii, Malaysia, Nigeria, Norway, Portugal, Puerto Rico, Rhodesia, Thailand, Trinidad, Uruguay, and Zaire all expressed problems among witnesses in their lands as to understanding the organization's policy or seeing its scriptural basis. Yet throughout the world Jehovah's Witnesses did take an adamant stand in rejecting alternative service, unless sentenced by a judge to perform it. Some may still be in jail in some lands for that reason. That this is really not the result of loyalty to God's word and their personal conviction of the unscripturalness of the course is evident from what follows. Conformity to an organizational policy, and concern that they not be viewed adversely by that organization and by their peers, seems to be the determinative factor for these young men. While some of the quotations just made touch on this aspect, other letters from the committees were quite explicit, revealing the basic reason why witnesses rejected alternative service provisions made by the governments in their lands. Belgium, few brothers are really in position to explain with the Bible why they refuse. Basically, they know it is wrong and that the society views it as such. For that reason some courts said to the brothers that they were pushed by the society to refuse the provision of the civil service. Denmark, while many young brothers seem able to grasp arguments and think them out and explain them to a degree, it is felt that the majority of young brothers today follow the example of others and take the stand expected of them by the brotherhood without really understanding the basic principles and arguments involved, and without being able to explain their stand clearly. Hawaii, generally speaking, the brothers here have trouble seeing Bible principles governing the maintaining of strict neutrality. Once they know the society's stand on such issues, they fully cooperate, but do not see the principles too clearly upon which our stand rests. Norway, the brothers in Norway do not accept civilian work without a court sentence, mainly because they know that this is the society's policy and they are loyal to the society. It is difficult for them to understand why it is wrong to accept civilian work when the work itself is not wrong and condemned by the Bible. They cannot support their stand properly from the scriptures. Spain, when an elder discusses the matter of substitute service with someone, that person generally accepts the position that substitution amounts to equivalence. But this idea is not usually truly understood. Rather, it is taken to be the organization's viewpoint, and the elders present it as well as they can, and the brothers loyally follow through as they know is expected of them. But it seems to us that many brothers find our reasoning somewhat artificial. Thailand, from our experience, many in the past have had problems when trying to maintain their neutrality. Many have refused work out of a kind of group loyalty. They did not know the reason or principle why, but they heard a certain thing was wrong, so they refused. Lloyd Barry's memorandum spoke of planting ideas in the minds of the brothers. The evidence clearly indicates that any planting done was by the Watchtower Society itself, since it is plain that these witnesses would never have arrived at the policy laid down by the organization from their own reading of the scriptures or as a product of their personal conscience. Nor was it only those of the so-called rank and file or the younger witnesses who had such serious difficulty with the policy. Men on the branch committees themselves found it difficult to support, either on the basis of reason or scripture. Referring again to Lloyd Barry's memorandum, he also stated, in this, the issue is not taxation, employment, etc., but compromise. We are agreed that we should not take up arms for the military. Then we should be agreed, too, that if the military or any other agency asks us to do something as a substitute therefor, we do not accept the alternative. That is our action. Then, if we are handed over to a court, and a judge sentences us, that is his action. We accept the sentence. We have not compromised. We are integrity keepers. It is as simple as all that. Job, chapter 27 verse 5. Yet, along with most other witnesses, many of the branch committee members themselves did not find the stated position by any means simple. They saw no logic in the position that it would be wrong to accept a work order from a draft board but all right to accept the identical order to do the identical work under identical circumstances if that order was given by a court. They could not see how this could be so, inasmuch as these agencies are all simply branches of the same government, of the same superior authority. Thus the Chilean branch committee pointed out some of the inconsistencies, saying, if the work itself does not contribute toward the military objective, does it matter what agency orders that it be accepted? Here in Chile it is not clear just how independent courts are. This is a military government and many of the civilians who serve in the cabinet are just showpieces. The military run the show. It is all just one system. From then communist Poland came this expression, as far as we know, the German brothers take up such work upon the basis that the administrative authorities direct them to the work and not the military. Would this mean that they would not take up the same work, under the same conditions, if the military authorities would direct them to do it? Is it not the same Caesar? In a very lengthy letter, the Canadian Branch Committee focused especially on this point. Referring to the existing policy as a confusing agency approach, they said, we feel that officials would find it hard to see where we draw the line. We would complicate matters for them and for the brothers as well. If, for example, we tried to make a point of the draft board or induction center being a part of the political setup and that we are neutral in matters of politics, they would wonder why the courts are not also viewed as an arm of the same governmental political setup. On the other hand, if we try to make it a matter of the agency being a part of the military setup and argue our neutrality from that point of view, they might concede that they appreciate our desire to have nothing to do with the military, but if the actual work assigned is the same, regardless of the agency involved, then what's the difference? We would find that a problem to argue successfully. Today, courts, councils, police, induction centers and the military are all manifestations of Caesar's authority. All are, in one way or another, his agencies. The matter seemed summed up in this simple question from the Nigerian Branch Committee, if something is wrong scripturally, then why should a court order make it all right to do it? The questions themselves illustrate how the organization's policies have led to technical complexities as well as to confusion on the part of men sincerely seeking to be guided by God's own word. Illustrating to what extremes the organization's concept could and did lead, Consider this remarkable situation and stand presented by the branch committee in Sweden, even in such instances where our brothers have been offered to perform their national service training at their ordinary place of work, for example, at a county administration or the state railways, they refused, because they have held that they could not accept any substitute whatsoever for the national service training, not even if this was purely civil, or even meant that they could stay on in their ordinary daily occupations. Incredible as it may seem, that is actually the stand taken in that country on the basis of the organization's policy, namely, that even where the authorities, bending over backwards to accommodate the witness's religious position, in some cases offered to let their regular, customary job be counted as done in place of such training, they must refuse. This is not due to convictions personally arrived by the Swedish witnesses. It is due to being so sensitized by the organization's policy decreeing that substitute work was the equivalent of military service, that any offer of any kind had to be refused. The footnote reads, the Swedish government finally solved the matter by exempting Jehovah's Witnesses totally from all service. End of footnote. Following a zone trip to branch offices in Scandinavian countries, Robert Wallen, the secretary for the service committee of the governing body, expressed his concern to me on this matter. He related a conversation with one Scandinavian witness who said, if I accept the government's assignment of alternative service, they will assign me to work in a hospital here in my area and I will be able to live at home with my family. But the society's policy is that I cannot do this and must refuse. I will then be arrested, tried, and sentenced, and the court will again assign me to work in a hospital. But this time it will be in another part of the country. I will be doing exactly the same work, but I will be separated from my home and family. Does this really make sense? Branch committee members did not only question the logic of the organization's policy. They also presented scriptural evidence in favor of a different approach. As just one example, the branch committee in Brazil expressed the view of the committee, saying, the point is that the young man has made clear his stand to the military authorities, showing scripturally why he cannot participate in any war or even be trained for it. So, what scriptures could be used to show that it would be improper to do civilian work ordered by the authorities, since he has made clear his scriptural stand? This, that is, doing such assigned civilian work seems to be supported by Matthew, chapter 5 verse 41, Romans, chapter 13 verse 7, Titus, chapter 3 verse 1-3, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 13, 14, and others. The scriptures they referred to read as follows: New World Translation, Matthew, chapter 5 verse 41, if someone under authority impresses you into service for a mile, go with him 2 miles. Romans, chapter 13 verse 7, render to all their dues, to him who calls for the tax, to him who calls for the tribute, to him who calls for fear, such fear, to him who calls for honor, such honor. Titus, chapter 3 verse 1-3 continue reminding them to be in subjection and be obedient to governments and authorities as knighters, to be ready for every good work, to speak injuriously of no one, not to be belligerent, to be reasonable, exhibiting all mildness toward all men. For even we were once senseless, disobedient, being misled, being slaves to various desires and pleasures, carrying on badness and envy, abhorrent, hating one another. 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 13, 14, for the Lord's sake subject yourselves to every human creation, whether to kings as being superior or to governors, as being sent by him to inflict punishment on evildoers but to praise doers of good. Reading the letters of these branch committee members, I could not help but contrast the thoughtfulness and breadth of viewpoint many of their expressions revealed as compared with the narrowness and rigidity of the assertions made by several of the governing body members. I had already submitted to the governing body a 14-page, carefully documented discussion of the biblical and historical evidence relative to submission to government authority when that authority orders a citizen to perform certain work or service of a non-military nature. Among other things, I felt that the evidence clearly showed that performance of such service came within the scriptural designation of taxation, since taxation from ancient times has included compulsory forms of labor. As just one example, at 1 Kings, chapter 5 verse 13 to 18 we read, New World Translation, of Solomon's bringing up those conscripted for forced labor out of all Israel. The Hebrew expression rendered forced labor is the word mas, meaning compulsory labor. When the translators of the Septuagint version, of the 3rd century BC, translated this Hebrew term, not only here but in other texts where it appears, what Greek term did they employ? They rendered it by the Greek term phedros. That is the identical term used by Paul at Romans, chapter 13 verse 6 when he speaks of paying tax to the superior authorities. The footnote reads, It may also be remarked that Paul is notable among the writers of the Christian scriptures in his frequent use of the Septuagint renderings when quoting from the Hebrew scriptures, and this is particularly true in his letter to the Romans. End of footnote. While the term can and undoubtedly does in most cases apply to a money tax, it is in no way restricted to this, as the Septuagint's use of it for compulsory labor forcefully demonstrates. The footnote reads, The November 1, 1990, Watchtower, page 11, gives a typically one-sided presentation of the matter, stating that Paul's references to tax, and tribute, at Romans 13 refer specifically to money paid to the state. It cites Luke, chapter 10 verse 22 as proof, as if the single reference to a monetary tax there is binding on the sense of phedros everywhere. Evidently the writer made only a cursory study of the subject, yet writes with great definiteness. Even the organization's own Kingdom Interlinear Translation acknowledges the breadth of application of the term for us. For the term's basic meaning, its interlinear reading shows, not money paid, or even tax, but simply the thing brought. The thing brought could have been money, or produce or service in the form of compulsory labor. In biblical times tax could and did involve any of these. End of footnote. I regret that in view of its lengthiness it is not possible to present here the complete discussion and the scriptural, historical, lexicographical, and etymological documentation provided. What was the result of all this? Remember that any decision made would affect the lives of thousands of persons. The existing policy had already resulted in imprisonments representing tens of thousands of years. Again, I believe the way the matter was handled is remarkably revealing. It illustrates dramatically the way long-standing, traditional policies can exercise overruling power on the thinking of men who have declared their determination to let God's word be their sole and supreme authority. The governing body met and discussed the issue in 4 separate sessions extending from September 26 to November 15, 1978. In all these 4 days of discussion the letters submitted received only cursory attention. None of the arguments or questions received careful analysis or point-by-point discussion, and this was equally true of the 14 pages of biblical and historical evidence I had personally supplied. The meetings were typical of most governing body sessions in that there was no particular order of discussion, no systematic consideration of one question or point at issue before moving on to consideration of another point at issue. Discussion could jump, as it typically did, from one aspect of the problem to another entirely different and relatively unrelated aspect. One member might conclude with the question, what scriptural basis is there then for saying that because a service is alternative it therefore becomes the equivalent of what it substitutes for? The next member recognized by the chairman might take up a totally different point, leaving the previous member's question hanging in midair. The footnote reads, the question of substitution equaling equivalency had been raised in the letter, from Belgium, that initiated the whole discussion. The writer, Michel Weber, was an elder who had visited witnesses in prison in his country and realized their inability to grasp the reasoning behind the society's policy. Among other things, he asked why, after refusing a blood transfusion, we did not consistently also refuse any substitute given in place of blood. Should not the reasoning apply in the same way? End of footnote. Those favoring retention of the existing policy referred to the branch committee letters primarily to discount their importance. Thus, Ted Urash said, regardless of what the brothers may say, it is the Bible that guides us. He then went on to discuss some points, not from the Bible, but from certain Watchtower articles dealing with the issue. Yet many of the branch committee men had brought up serious points from the Bible, and these had neither been refuted nor clearly answered, at least not to the satisfaction of the majority of the governing body members themselves, as subsequent voting revealed. Ted Urash, however, urged that we should ask ourselves, just how much of a problem is it all over the world? He asked this because the survey showed that the majority of the countries had no provision for alternative service. Acknowledging that perhaps 100 or so are disfellowshipped as a result of the existing policy, he asked, what of all the other brothers in the worldwide organization who rejected alternative service, and what of the suffering already undergone by those who took such stand? This question would seem to say that, because a past wrong view caused considerable suffering, this would somehow justify the continuance of the wrong view, and the suffering it would continue to produce. It exemplifies how traditional policies can, in the minds of some, override both scripture and logic. As a further reason for maintaining the policy that led to this suffering, he added, if we allow the brothers this latitude, we will have serious problems, similar to those where latitude is shown in matters of employment. In reality, the only problems that latitude in matters of employment had produced were problems for those seeking to maintain tight control over the activities of fellow Christians. Whatever risk there might be was not truly to the morality or Christian integrity of the congregation. What was at risk was the exercise of ecclesiastical authority. Indicative of this, the Society's president, Franz, also expressed doubt as to the weight to be given to the expressions of the branch committee members. He reminded the body that he had not voted in favor of the worldwide survey, and then, sharply increasing the force of his tone, asked, where does all this information come from anyway? Does it come from the top down? Or from the bottom up? He said that we should not build our decision around the situations found in different countries. As noted, this phrase regarding top and bottom was not new to me. As recently as 1971, in a Watchtower article, Franz had used it, along with reference to the rank and file members of the organization. But the whole tone of the discussion was extremely upsetting to me, particularly such expressions as if we allow the brothers this latitude. When recognized by Chairman Klein, I reminded the members that it was the governing body's decision to write the branch committee members, that those men were among the most respected elders in their respective countries, and if we could not give weight to their expressions, then to whose expressions could we do so? I felt compelled to add that my understanding was that we considered ourselves as a brotherhood and had no reason to look on ourselves as the top of anything, that we should even find the concept personally repelling. What, then, was the final outcome? At the October 11, 1978, meeting, of the 16 members then on the body, 13 were present and 9 voted for a change in the traditional policy. 4, Henschel, Jackson, Klein, and Franz, did not. This not being a 2/3 majority of the total membership, no change was made. On November 15, the vote showed 11 of 16 in favor of a change, a 2/3 majority. The motion voted on was one of several suggested and happened to be one I had submitted. It read, motion. That where the superior authorities in any land, acting through whatever constituted agency they use, order a brother to perform some form of work, whether because of his conscientious objection to military service or for other reasons, there will be no congregational action taken against such a brother if he submits to that order, provided always that the work he is ordered to do is not in violation of direct commands or clear scriptural principles found in God's Word, including that at Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. Matthew, chapter 5 verse 41, 22 verse 21, 1 Corinthians, chapter 13 verse 1 to 7, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 17, Titus, chapter 3 verse 1, Acts, chapter 5 verse 29. We will continue to exhort our brothers to guard against becoming a part of the world, and that in whatever circumstances they find themselves they must keep God's kingdom foremost, never forgetting that they are slaves of God and of Christ. Thus they should seek to avail themselves of any provision that allows them the greatest freedom to use time, strength, and funds for that kingdom. John, chapter 15 verse 17 to 19, Acts, chapter 25 verse 9 to 11, 1 Corinthians, chapter 7 verse 21, 23. A two-thirds majority had voted in favor of the motion, but the two-thirds majority did not last long. During a momentary break in the session, a member remarked that there evidently was going to be a change in the vote. He quoted President Franz, who was among those not favoring any change, as saying, "It isn't over yet, Barry has had second thoughts." Lloyd Barry had been among the 11 voting in favor of the motion. Why the change? Since the decision could make the difference between men going to prison or not going to prison, I think it is enlightening to realize just what sort of things can happen in a religious governing body holding power to affect the lives of thousands of persons. You will note that in the cited texts at the end of the first paragraph of the motion the citation 1 Corinthians, chapter 13 verse 1 to 7 appears. I had meant to put Romans, chapter 13 verse 1 to 7 but, perhaps because of familiarity with Paul's well-known description of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, I mistakenly wrote it down as I did. Someone called the matter to my attention during the intermission and the body was informed of the need to correct this one reference. When we reconvened, however, Lloyd Barry stated that he would not vote in favor of the motion with Romans chapter 13 listed in the citations. Given the opportunity to speak, I suggested to Lloyd that we could simply eliminate the reference completely or even remove all the cited texts if need be to make the motion acceptable for him. Without explaining the basis for his objection, he said he would still not vote for the motion and that he was withdrawing his previous vote. Other members endeavored to find some conciliatory adjustment but were unsuccessful. Though no provision had existed for withdrawal of one's vote after a motion had passed, we acceded to Barry's action. The two-thirds majority was gone. After further discussion, when another vote was taken it read, 9 in favor, 5 against, 1 abstention. The footnote reads, Lloyd Barry had left on some business matter and so was not present for this vote made necessary by his withdrawal of his previous vote. The 5 voting against change were Carrie Barber, Fred Franz, Milton Henschel, William Jackson, and Carl Klein. Ted Urash abstained. See also Crisis of Conscience, page 135. End of footnote. Though still a definite majority, it was no longer a two-thirds majority. Though only a minority of the governing body favored the continuance of the existing policy and the sanctions it applied toward any who accepted alternative service, unless sentenced thereto, that policy remained in effect. Year after year, hundreds of men, submitting to that policy although neither understanding it nor being convinced of its rightness, would continue to be arrested, tried, and imprisoned, because one individual on a religious council changed his mind. Witness men could exercise their conscientious choice of accepting alternative service only at the cost of being cut off from the congregations of which they were a part, being viewed as unfaithful to God and Christ. Surely such instances make clear why no Christian should ever be expected to mortgage his conscience to any religious organization or to any body of men exercising virtually unlimited authority over people's lives. I found the whole affair disheartening, tragic. Yet I felt that I learned more clearly just to what ends the very nature of an authority structure can lead men, how it can cause them to take rigid positions they would not normally take. This case illustrated the way in which the power of tradition, coupled with a technical legalism and a mistrust of people's motives, can prevent one from taking a compassionate stand. The matter came up on one other occasion and the vote was evenly split. Thereafter it was dropped and for most members it seemed to become a non-issue. The organization, following its voting rules, had spoken. The branch committee's arguments need not be answered, they could simply be informed that nothing had changed and they would proceed accordingly. The men in prison would never know that the matter had even been discussed and that, consistently, half or more of the governing body did not believe they needed to be where they were. Illustrating the frequent flaw of inconsistency found in such reasoning is the way a parallel issue was later handled. It originated in Belgium, the country from which the whole issue of alternative service had arisen. The Belgian branch office asked for a ruling on another issue. Belgian law provided for the selecting and assigning of certain persons, generally attorneys, to serve at voting locations during political elections, to assure that the voting procedures were carried on properly. The branch committee wanted to know if this was permissible for witness attorneys. Remarkably, the governing body ruled that to serve in this manner would not disqualify one as an approved witness, though it is difficult to imagine an assignment that would place one in closer contact and involvement with the political process than this. Generalization and categorization. Another hallmark of thinking legalistically is the practice of generalizing and categorizing. That is, because certain aspects of a matter are bad, the tendency is to generalize by saying that the whole thing is bad. This is essentially the same kind of unwarranted generalizing which categorizes a whole national or racial group as contaminated because a percentage of individuals within that group or race are guilty of some wrongdoing or wrong attitude. By this generalizing, people of such nationality or race are viewed as criminally inclined, or dishonest, or lazy and unreliable, or greedy and crafty, simply because the whole is judged on the basis of the part. Prejudice is the result, and it betrays shallow thinking. It takes care and judgment to estimate people as individuals, person by person. Lumping them all together in a single category is obviously easier. It is also grossly unfair and illogical. In governing body discussions, I began to realize to what extent decisions were based on a similar kind of unwarranted generalizing and categorizing. In so many of the policies developed, focus was placed on organizational membership rather than on what an individual actually did or was. If some fault could be found with a part of a particular organization's practices or standards, often the whole organization, and everyone in it, was condemned and viewed as a taboo area for witnesses. This approach allows for viewing all other professed Christian religious affiliations as intrinsically bad. By finding fault with certain of the religion's teachings, the religion in its totality can now be viewed as unclean, and any person affiliated with it is also unclean, outside God's favor. This approach makes even membership in the YMCA a disfellowshipping offense. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, January 1, 1979, pages 30 and 31. End of footnote. The fact that I think there is something unchristian in a religion hardly gives me the right to judge all its members as totally unacceptable to God. This is following the principle of guilt by association, a principle that was used against Jesus by religious leaders. Compare Matthew, chapter 9 verse 11, chapter 11 verse 19. Following this principle, it does not matter what kind of person the individual may be, what his personal beliefs are, how much devotion he personally shows to God's word, how high the standards are by which he lives. Unless he ceases affiliation with any of such religious groups, and takes up membership within Jehovah's Witnesses, he will be destroyed by God at the time of the Great Tribulation. Paradoxically, when individuals associated with Jehovah's Witnesses find some of their own organization's teachings to be unscriptural or its practices to be unchristian, they are told that they should not be overly critical, should not expect perfection, should stick with the organization, waiting on God eventually to clear matters up. Generalizing and categorizing are particularly prominent in matters of employment, as has been seen. In many cases, the factor that determines whether a particular employment is ruled acceptable or not is, not what the work performed actually is, but whether it is supervised by, paid by, or performed on the property of, a religious organization or a military organization. At Romans chapter 13, verse 4, the Apostle Paul wrote of the superior authority of government, "It is God's minister to you for your good. But if you are doing what is bad, be in fear, for it is not without purpose that it bears the sword, for it is God's minister, an avenger to express wrath upon the one practicing what is bad." The sword of the superior authority in Paul's day was the military, for there was no separate police force operative in his time. The purpose of the Roman army in Palestine was to maintain the Pax Romana, and in doing so it served particularly as a force for peace and order, taking action against lawbreakers. It may be noted that in Paul's own experience it was the military that rescued him from the angry mob in the temple area. It was the military that protected him from an assassination plot and provided him safe conduct to Caesarea. The footnote reads, Acts, chapter 21 verse 35 to 40, chapter 23 verse 16 to 35. End of footnote. To this day, military forces often are more active in maintenance of law and order in times of crisis than they are in warfare. In the Dominican Republic during my years of service there, many occasions arose when the danger of riots and violence got beyond police control, and it was the military forces that were then brought in to serve as the prime peacekeepers. While one may rightly feel conscientious objections to the wrongs involved in military aggression and bloodshed and to participation in these, that does not justify a refusal to recognize any beneficial service performed by military forces or provide the basis for categorizing everything connected with the military as inherently, automatically, and totally bad, so that any contact therewith is contaminating, making one blood guilty. The same is true of politics. It is easy to convert this term into a synonym for all the unsavory aspects appearing in human rule. The divisiveness and selfish ambition typical of much political campaigning, with its slurs and smears, along with the hypocrisy, corruption, and tyranny that are all too often to be found in political systems, can be used by this equation to classify as automatically bad anything to which the term political can be attached. It is this same blanket condemnation and categorization that produced the organization's policy in Malawi with its calamitous results. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 145 to 148. End of footnote. But politics basically means government, and the scriptures teach that government definitely has a beneficial aspect. According to Watchtower policy, if a witness were ordered by the government to serve as the secretary of some government-arrant community administration, as took place in the Philippines with its system of barangays, he must refuse, even at the risk of fine or imprisonment, to avoid disfellowshipment. This is difficult to harmonize with the attitude of Daniel and his three companions during the political rule of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires. Not only did Daniel accept appointment to a high position in the Babylonian political structure, he actually requested administrative positions for his three friends. This was not some display of a lack of integrity, for they proved themselves willing to face death rather than be disloyal to God. Daniel, chapter 3 verse 8 to 18, in the automatically and intrinsically evil simply because it bears the name political. With regard to Daniel, in the matter of serving in the governmental, political, structure, they showed conscientious discrimination, not blanket categorization. Christians today can also reject the bad and shun it while still recognizing whatever good there may be. I could not conscientiously share in political campaigning with its divisive, aggressive tactics. Yet that does not cause me to view anything as automatically and intrinsically evil simply because it bears the name political. With regard to Daniel and his three companions, there is additional evidence of their ability to distinguish what was truly an issue and what was not. This is in connection with the names that were assigned to them by the Babylonians. If not in all, then at least in some cases those names included the names of Babylonian gods. The footnote reads, Daniel, chapter 1 verse 6, 7. See Insight on the Scriptures under Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. End of footnote. Nebuchadnezzar himself is shown as specifically saying of the name assigned to Daniel, Belteshazzar, that this was after the name of my God. Daniel, chapter 4 verse 8, 9, Bel, corresponding to the Canaanite term Baal, was a chief Babylonian god. I seriously doubt that any of Jehovah's Witnesses would have responded if addressed by a name assigned him by a pagan source and having any connection whatsoever with the name of a false god. Yet the accounts in the book of Daniel show that, when addressed by these names, Daniel and his three companions did not refuse to reply. The footnote reads, Daniel, chapter 3 verse 13 to 18, chapter 4 verse 19. End of footnote. I think of this when recalling some of the extreme measures witnesses have felt obliged to take to demonstrate strict neutrality, complete separateness from the world, primarily as a result of the organization's highly sensitizing them by its categorizing policies. There is an inordinate concern for how things will appear, rather than what the reality is. In the modern state of Israel, witnesses who refused military service were imprisoned. They were issued military clothing to wear. Whatever the appearance may have been, the reality was that they were prisoners due to their stand. Nonetheless, they refused to wear the garments, and some even went around in their underclothes rather than put on such clothing. One governing body suggestion was that they might wear it turned inside out to register their objection. Yet how much more is a name viewed as an identification than is a uniform, and Daniel's responding to the name Belteshazzar could not but come to mind. He knew that this appellative did not change what he was, and, when a genuine issue arose, was willing to demonstrate what he was, though it meant facing death in a den of lions. Daniel, chapter 6 verse 6 to 23, had he been governed by watchtower indoctrination and policy, he surely would have not displayed such a balanced, discerning viewpoint. Somewhat related is the way in which the Watchtower organization now uses abstention from celebration of various holidays, or even birthdays, as evidence of superior righteousness. I still am not a celebrator of those holidays, yet I recognize that an exaggerated importance has been attached to them, with celebration or non-celebration being viewed as determining whether one is a practicer of pure worship or is worthy of disfellowshipment. Much is made of the pagan origin of various practices and items connected with some of the holidays. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower Publication School and Jehovah's Witnesses, 1983, pages 18 to 20. End of footnote. Yet, realistically, any pagan significance these may once have had has long since disappeared. I remember in the 1970s giving a talk that discussed the need not to go overboard in these matters, pointing out, among other things, that the very days of the week, in English, involve the names of pagan objects of worship, the sun, the moon, and of the gods and goddesses Chwi, Woden, Thor, Free and Saturn. The same is true of many of the names of months. The footnote reads, these include use of the names of the two-faced god Janus, Februa, a pagan feast of purification, Mars, god of war, and Maia, a Roman goddess. End of footnote. Yet today we employ those names without the slightest thought of their pagan origin. Actually, most persons are totally unaware of their pagan source. This is similarly true of the various decorations and customs connected with many holidays. While placing intense emphasis on the pagan origin factor, the Watchtower organization simply glosses over this in other areas, as in the use of wedding rings. Their own publication, What Has Religion Done for Mankind? 1951, pages 276, 277, quotes Catholic Cardinal Newman as saying that, along with such things as the use of temples, incense, candles, etc., the ring in marriage is among those things that are of pagan origin, and sanctified by their adoption into the Church. The footnote reads, Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, John Henry Newman, 1878, pages 355, 371, 373, edition of 1881. End of footnote. Yet almost all of Jehovah's Witnesses use the ring in marriage, something their own publication reveals as of pagan origin. I recall that when the Watchtower Society purchased a former motion picture theater in Queens, New York, for use as an assembly hall, the theater had an ancient Egyptian motif throughout. Over the marquee, the front of the building had large tiles depicting various Egyptian gods and goddesses, one even carrying the crux ansata. The inside contained other items, including lotus flowers, having religious connotations in Egyptian beliefs. When the Watchtower renovated the building, all these items were left unchanged. After a few years, a friend of ours from the Dominican Republic attended a Gilead school graduation there as our guest. She was struck by the pagan symbolisms and expressed her upset feelings to me, saying that she would not have known what the meaning of these things was had she not read of them in the Watchtower's own publications. The footnote reads, see, For example, the book What Has Religion Done for Mankind? Pages 106 to 119. End of footnote. She could not harmonize the strong, negative statements made in the publications with this apparent tolerance. I felt obliged to write to President Noor, pointing out that my concern was primarily for her, and others who might feel as she did. Noor came down to my office and argued the matter, saying that the items were simply decorations and that, for example, he didn't think persons looking at the lotuses would attribute a sexual connotation to them. He asked if I thought that we could not even make use of a Catholic translation because it might have a cross on its front. I told him that I myself was not hypersensitive about such things, but that I thought we had an obligation to be concerned if there is an adverse effect on others, that if we set forth a particular standard for others then people have a right to expect us to live by it ourselves. Not long afterward the tile depictions of gods and goddesses were painted over. The inside of the building remained essentially the same. More recently the Watchtower purchased the large Bossard Hotel in Brooklyn. It has gargoyles ornamenting the outside. These, too, are viewed by the organization as inconsequential decorations, void of any serious significance. As I found true in so many cases, stringent requirements placed on witnesses of the rank and file suddenly seemed capable of great relaxation when the organization's own interests were involved. Persons among the witnesses have been disfellowshipped for holding birthday celebrations. The core of the Watchtower argument seems to be based upon the principle of guilt by association, that because only Pharaoh and Herod are mentioned in Scripture as celebrating birthdays, and because these were wicked men, therefore the celebration of a birthday is necessarily wicked also. The footnote reads, see Reasoning from the Scriptures, 1985, pages 68, 69, School and Jehovah's Witnesses, page 17, 18. End of footnote. This is certainly a forced conclusion. If, as an illustration, the Scriptures had no reference to marriage feasts other than marriage feasts held by two pagans or non-Christians, perhaps even with some coincidental drunkenness or immorality occurring, would that make marriage feasts something wrong, unfit for Christians? The Watchtower employs quotations about the absence of birthday celebrations by Jews or by professed Christians in early centuries. Is that really a substantial reason for taking a rigid stand? Did the Jews or the professed Christians in early centuries celebrate wedding anniversaries? Would the fact that they did not rule out our doing so today? Jehovah's Witnesses in many countries regularly do celebrate wedding anniversaries. The idea advanced that birthday celebrations are intrinsically an idolizing of the person is an unrealistic categorization. Couples who celebrate a wedding anniversary are not idolizing themselves nor idolizing their marriage. Like so many other things, it is the way in which things are done, the spirit shown, and this can vary widely. The footnote reads, one of my wife's sisters has a son, an only child conceived fairly late in the marriage and born with a heart defect. The parents were warned that he might not live beyond the age of 2, but surgery performed when he reached that age corrected the problem. As the mother said, some people celebrate wedding anniversaries, but to my husband and me the day that our son was born is more precious to our memory even than the day of our wedding. End of footnote. Nowhere in the Scriptures is there any indication of God's disapproval of birthday celebrations per se. They are silent in that respect. It is a case of men presuming to know God's thinking and making judgments and rulings that God himself has not made. In all this I am not advocating any of these celebrations. I simply believe that, viewed calmly and factually, they are matters of minor significance, never warranting the sense of superior righteousness produced by witness abstention, and certainly never justifying the policy of disfellowshipment now in force. The mere fact of knowing that something is not condemned does not make it appealing. I myself am basically repelled by the shallowness and commercialism of many holidays. I have negative feelings about the practice of having a child make a wish while blowing out candles, as is done in this country, since that fosters a superstitious view, or bringing in such fictions as Santa Claus. Yet I believe that for me to attribute such grave seriousness to these matters as though of life and death importance and to judge others on that basis would be to go beyond what Christian teaching authorizes. In its absolutist approach and categorizing practice, a paradox is found in that Watchtower organizational policy allows membership in labor unions. Yet the organization knows that labor unions are clearly a strong political force. It condemns participation in strikes as being a form of coercion by intimidation. It rules that anyone holding an official position in a union is not exemplary, hence could not be an elder or ministerial servant. It declares picketing to be unchristian, yet, strangely, says that if, on refusing picketing work, the witness is directed to do substitute work, alternative service, of cleaning the union hall or answering telephones there, this is up to his conscience. The footnote reads, the suggested correspondence guidelines, after citing Ephesians, chapter 6 verse 5 to 8, Colossians, chapter 3 verse 22 to 24, and 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 18, 19, says, labor unions do not agree with the counsel set out in these scriptures and do not act in harmony with it. Later it says, a united wage demand is a club, a threat to the employer of a severe economic blow if he does not do what is demanded. It is a means of obtaining something from an unwilling employer by intimidation. This same material discusses picketing and substitute work in place thereof. See also The Watchtower, February 15, 1961, page 128. End of footnote. Why is such service in substitution for picketing not viewed in the same way that work in substitution for military service has been? And why, with all these claimed unchristian aspects, does membership in the union not make the witness laborer unclean, tainted? How does the Watchtower Society get around the evident contradiction in policy? It does this by simply telling witnesses that they can look on union membership as a form of job insurance. Yet they could not look on membership in the YMCA and use of its exercise or swimming facilities as health insurance, or, in the case of Malawian witnesses, the holding of a party card as home insurance, or even life insurance. The footnote reads, for the destruction of witness homes and loss of life in Malawi, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 112 to 116. It would seem likely that the organizational position on labor unions is due to their playing such a major role in the employment field. To take a stand consistent with their views regarding other objectionable organizations and require that all witnesses renounce union membership would undoubtedly create a major unemployment problem and severe economic difficulties for thousands of witnesses. The organization has no real arrangement for caring for its members in such circumstances, particularly in the industrialized nations. Whatever the case, the policy demonstrates that, when it wishes to, the organization can make remarkable exceptions and dispensations. End of footnote. Once again, it is a case of religious leaders dictating to the individual as to when he or she may hold mental reservations and when not. Compare Matthew, chapter 15 verse 3 to 9. The governing body is willing, for legal benefits, to classify the witness organization as hierarchical, though outside of the courts it would deny that as being the case. This is certainly a seeking of accommodation by a measure of compromise. Compromise is not something necessarily or inherently wrong. It implies a degree of yielding, and life demands certain compromise on the part of all of us in order to live and work with others. The wrong comes when we begin to compromise our principles. The organization accords to itself the right to present itself to the world in a form it elsewhere strongly condemns, and not view this as a compromise of principle, but denies to its members the corresponding right to decide what they can do in good conscience when faced with circumstances equally, or even more, difficult for them. The view the religious leadership chooses to take regarding a matter is imposed on all below as the view they must take. The fact that the governing body members in their cloistered, protected, ivory tower circumstances rarely have to face the difficulties, hardship, or problems that the ordinary witnesses must face, seems to have no cautionary or restraining effect on their readiness to impose their views on the individual members. Setting double standards. Yet another common failing seen in religious legalism is the existence of double standards, the setting of one set of standards for yourself and another for others. As Jesus said of those who, in effect, seated themselves in Moses' seat by acting as advocates of the Mosaic law, therefore all the things they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say but do not perform. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 23 verse 3, the New World Translation. End of footnote. The evidence of that attitude was one of the more disturbing factors for me as a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. In Crisis of Conscience, I set out a few examples of the application of double standards. The footnote reads, see Crisis of Conscience, pages 142 to 171. End of footnote. They formed only part of the whole. Consider, for example, these quotations dealing with honesty in business. Do we really respect the truth, or are we willing to twist the truth a little bit, to get out of an inconvenient circumstance, or to get something we want? Lying is a common practice in business today. Do you, in a tight spot, feel a temptation to lie as the easy way out? The footnote reads, The Watchtower, January 15, 1974, page 58. End of footnote. Sometimes what we have to say to another has to be put in writing. For some reason, individuals who would never lie orally feel that it is a different matter when reporting income for taxes or writing an itemized declaration for customs agents at an international border. This cheating costs all taxpayers. Is that real love of neighbor? Besides, do not Christians have an obligation to pay back Caesar's things to Caesar? Unscrupulous men may resort to double talk to misrepresent and deceive. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, February 15, 1988, page 4. End of footnote. Paul continues, render to all their dues, to him who calls for the tax, to him who calls for the tribute. Romans, chapter 13 verse 7, the word all embraces every secular authority that is God's public servant. There are no exceptions. Even if we live under a political system that we personally do not like, we pay taxes. No Christian should illegally evade paying taxes. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, November 1, 1990, page 24. End of footnote. Truly all this sets a high standard. I recall a letter sent to the headquarters from Italy on this issue. It stated that in that country the practice of understating business profit was so common and widespread that it was a government practice to automatically adjust tax returns by adding a certain percentage to the amount reported. The question was asked if, in view of this, it was required for a witness in business to state the actual amount of his business income knowing it would be taken as too low, or if it was up to him to decide how to report it so as to pay what the tax laws actually called on him to pay. The governing body ruled that the matter was not up to the individual and that the full amount must be reported. Articles in the Watchtower magazine in the section Questions from Readers have similarly set out very stringent standards on such matters, and witnesses failing to adhere to these are subject to discipline, in some cases to disfellowshipment. I have no question whatever as to the importance of the principle of honesty, or to the praise given it in the articles above quoted. What I do question is whether it was up to a religious council to dictate to the individual in specific and unusual circumstances and, in effect, tell him how his conscience should react. One reason for feeling this way was knowledge of the organization's own practices in such areas. As one example, the branch committee in Colombia, in preparation for an annual zone visit of a headquarters representative, made up a list of questions to which they sought answers. Some involved their concern about certain accounting policies that the organization had established and which they were following. Thus the sixth question on the list dealt with the branch's reporting of certain income to the government as donations, while showing it on their books for the society as investment returns. They felt disturbed about this, and this photocopy of their material shows how they explained their feelings, according to Colombian law for non-profit corporations. We are prohibited from making loans on which interest is charged. Doing so would classify us as a commercial firm and liable to pay corporate taxes at the rate for limited partnerships. At the moment we classify the income from Hall loan repayments, which includes interest, as donations for purposes of reporting to the government on our tax return. However, on the society books this income is classed as investment returns, and on the individual loan ledgers the payments on principal and interest are clearly identified. Could we have your comments on the moral aspects of this procedure? Their seventh question dealt with a similar juggling of information regarding foreign missionaries that had been introduced into the country. We have work contracts with our missionaries and certify them as employees to the government ministry that deals with foreigners. We must do this in order to get them into the country. However, on our tax returns we show that we have no employees. This is to avoid paying employer contributions to Social Security, etc., and to avoid problems with intricate fringe benefits required by everybody does it. But how do we stand morally? In both cases it may be noted that the reason for their irregular method of reporting to the government was the evasion of certain taxes or other expenses. While the principle that Christians obey all laws except those in violation of God's law is a true one, that principle could not justify failure to comply with these Colombian tax laws. The footnote reads, Acts, chapter 5 verse 29, compare Romans, chapter 13 verse 5 to 7. End of footnote. Again, it should be noted that these accounting methods did not originate in the Colombia branch office. On the basis of personal knowledge, both from having served as branch overseer in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, as well as from having made official visits as a governing body member to branch offices in many countries, I know that no branch establishes its own accounting policies. They are all determined by the central headquarters organization. The branch in Colombia was simply conforming to Watchtower Society practices employed in other countries as well. They did not feel that they could deviate from such practices without first obtaining permission, as their questions show. But, as indicated by their expressions, the men at the branch felt conscientiously disturbed as to the morality of the practices, doubtless because of contrasting them with the published statements in the organization's Watchtower magazine. To my knowledge, the practices set out were not changed. The second item from Colombia, shown above, touches on another inconsistency. As is well known, many people from Mexico cross into the United States as illegal aliens, seeking work and improved living conditions. Social Security cards are obtained based generally on false information. Some of these persons thereafter have lived in the country for decades, lived responsible lives, raised families, bought or built homes, even developed businesses. Some of these later become witnesses, at times many years later. The organization's policy has permitted those wishing to be baptized as Jehovah's Witnesses to do so. But males among them were not permitted to serve in any responsible way, either in the conducting of meetings, or as ministerial servants, or elders. The footnote reads, see, for example, The Watchtower, March 15, 1977, pages 191, 192. End of footnote. The view taken was that they are living a lie. They misrepresented themselves as if legally in the country and carried documents that were not genuine. To qualify for any responsibility they must go to the authorities and seek to legalize their situation. Otherwise the only other way to qualify would be to return to Mexico, which normally meant giving up their jobs, or business, selling or otherwise disposing of their homes and property if they owned such. The footnote reads, at the very same time this policy was in effect, as is documented in Crisis of Conscience, witness men in Mexico were carrying documents stating that they had fulfilled a military service that they had not fulfilled, documents obtained through a bribe, and many of them were knowingly approved by the organization as elders, circuit overseers, even as branch office representatives. The charge of living a lie was never leveled at them. End of footnote. Yet the organization has itself set up certain arrangements which produce a similar situation of illegality. At times the Watchtower Society has faced legal barriers in its efforts to send its trained missionaries into certain countries, in South America, Europe, Africa, and the South Pacific. The particular country may refuse to grant entry visas or perhaps residence visas to Watchtower missionaries. The Watchtower's sending in of missionaries in these instances is not usually because there are no witnesses in the country, but because of wanting to send in personnel that the organization has more directly trained in its teachings, policies, and methods. The work or worship of Jehovah's Witnesses is not dependent on their introduction into the country, but the organization believes that this will usually result in more rapid numerical growth or in more efficient handling of a branch office. Frequently the organization has made arrangements with a witness in the country who has a business or industry, and he has provided a letter or document affirming that the particular missionary, who is not identified as such in the document, is being hired to work for his firm. Or a witness connected with a firm that is not in that country, but which has international trade or dealings, may provide such a letter or document, stating that the individual will serve as the representative of such firm in the country targeted. The missionary, and his wife, if married, may go to the country as non-witnesses and, after arrival, may purposely, and according to organization instruction, stay away from meetings and association with witnesses, except perhaps some assigned contact person. Then, after a certain time, and making use of a visit from witnesses going door to door in their area, they act as if they are now becoming interested in the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses and soon begin to attend meetings. It is not long before they are working in the branch office or in some other capacity, all made successful by this pretense. I know personally of such cases, as for example, in the country of Portugal. In other cases, after arrival in the country the missionary will report to the documented place of business for one day only and not go back again, now spending his entire time in his missionary activity. Or, if supposedly representing a foreign firm, centered outside the country, he may make occasional reports of business contacts of a very perfunctory kind, all to keep up appearances. Another method, used in some South American countries, has been for the missionary to apply for entry as a student, going to study at a university in the country involved. Upon arrival, he or she will take the absolute minimum of classes required and spend all the rest of the time in witnessing activity or other activity designed to advance the organization's interests. Still others go into a country presenting themselves as tourists, and every 6 months or so they leave the country through one frontier city and, after a day or two, re-enter the country through the same city or one nearby. Some foreign Watchtower representatives in Spain and Mexico have lived in those countries for decades by using this method, during all those decades continuing to represent themselves as tourists, though often employed full-time at Watchtower branch offices. In all cases, these arrangements are worked out by the Watchtower headquarters organization, not at the initiative of the individual missionary. The reason for discussing these practices is not because of any interest in judging the ethical or moral nature of the practices of themselves, or the individuals involved. What disturbs me is, once again, the double standard applied, where the organization takes on itself the right to judge the morality of a practice when carried on by ordinary people, and their qualifying for appointment as exemplary persons, but considers itself above criticism or condemnation when doing the same thing in order to advance organizational interests. Whichever of the above methods are employed, the Watchtower representatives are, and realize that they are, living in such countries under false pretenses, contrary to the laws of the land. A laborer in Mexico who might feel desperate about the poverty-stricken situation of his wife and children and who entered the United States illegally and obtained work by representing himself as there legally, was classified as living a lie, and could not, upon becoming a witness, serve in an exemplary way in the congregation. But the organization could send its own representatives into a country, perhaps the same country from which the laborer came, Mexico, in a way that either violates the law or at least circumvents it through misrepresentation, with the representative acting out a role that is not authentic, not in accord with fact, and this is viewed as proper. It is in the interests of the society and its expansion. It is as if a lower standard of conduct is permissible and acceptable in religious operations and activities than would be counted acceptable in secular matters. The position seems to be that the end justifies the means as long as the end is one pursued by the organization, not one sought by an ordinary person. The scales of justice are thus weighted one way when measuring the righteousness of others, the opposite way when measuring your own. The footnote reads, Proverbs, chapter 20 verse 23. End of footnote. Similar examples of inconsistency may also be found even in Watchtower Council given witnesses, including young people, who are to testify under oath before a court. The legal department of the Society now supplies a brochure to witnesses who are faced with child custody cases, the opposing mate in such cases generally being a non-witness. The brochure of more than 60 pages supplies guidelines to witness parents, their children, and their attorneys, as well as local elders and others who may testify, by reviewing difficult questions that may be presented by the opposing side and then offering suggested sample responses. Recalling the Watchtower article on honesty cited earlier, we may remember that it asked, what about truthfulness? Do we really respect the truth, or are we willing to twist the truth a little bit, to get out of an inconvenient circumstance, or to get something we want? Compare that with some of the responses suggested in the Society's manual. Under approach by witness parent to cross-examination, we find this question and suggested answer, page 12. Will all Catholics, or other, be destroyed? Jehovah makes those judgments, not we. This sounds good, implies freedom from a dogmatic, judgmental attitude. Yet the witness so responding knows that his organization's publications clearly teach that only those who are in association with Jehovah's organization will survive the Great Tribulation, and that all those who fail to come to that organization face destruction. The footnote reads, the February 15, 1983, Watchtower, for example says, page 12, Jehovah is using only one organization today to accomplish his will. To receive everlasting life in the earthly paradise we must identify that organization and serve God as part of it. The September 1, 1989, Watchtower on page 19 says, only Jehovah's Witnesses, those of the anointed remnant and the great crowd, as a united organization under the protection of the Supreme Organizer, have any scriptural hope of surviving the impending end of this doomed system dominated by Satan the devil. End of footnote. In all the above examples cited, regarding business and financial practices, entry into foreign countries, or court testimony, there is no interest on my part to hold up any one method or practice discussed for condemnation. The issue is that of double standards. In our human imperfection, every one of us at some time fails by applying one standard for ourselves and another for others. It is to be hoped that we beg God's forgiveness and try not to repeat the wrong. We are all guilty at times of being inconsistent in our reasoning. Again, it is to be hoped that we try to learn from our mistakes, correct our thinking, exercise more care not to be dogmatic about our reasonings. I believe, however, that to promulgate worldwide organizational standards that are clearly unequal, maintain them for decades toward millions of people, while condemning any who do not observe them as unchristian wrongdoers, surely must carry a more serious accountability before God. I cannot believe that he who notes even the sparrow's fall does not take into consideration whatever unnecessary anxiety, despair, suffering or loss such policies may cause. I cannot believe that he overlooks as inconsequential the weakening effect on people's attitude toward his word that such unequal policies can have, the perverting and stifling effect they can have on conscience and the destructive effect they can have on Christian freedom. End of chapter 8.